Hello everyone. If it's your first time to the channel, welcome, and if it's not, welcome back. I really appreciate all of the support lately. If you enjoy the video, please consider liking and subscribing to the channel as it really helps for the YouTube algorithm. For today's video, we're going to be playtesting Magellan, which has actually been very surprising as it can do really well in some matchups that you wouldn't expect it to. So now let's get started with the deck list. For the deck, we're running 4 of the Hannibal, which work as a searcher for the majority of the deck. It can search out 2k counters, it can search out blockers, some of your double attackers, the heart and soul of the deck, which is the Magellan, and Hell's Judgment, which is a really good utility card. We're running 2 of the Shiki, which is a 2k counter and can be used in some matchups like Zoro as an extra body on the field to attack some of their smaller characters. We're running 4 of the Sadie, which work as a utility card both as a 2k counter and to sometimes help swarm the board with either your Mino Koalas, which are a blocker, or your Minotaurs, which are the double attackers. Running 4 of the Mino Koala, which is a blocker, which can also help you ramp. And we're running 4 of the Cow, the Minotaurs, which can help because they're double attackers, and same on KO has an effect. We're running 4 of the Uta, which are a blocker. And with the -1 can also rest another character, so it can essentially work as a double blocker. We're running 4 of the X Drake, which is also another 2k counter, and it has a utility effect at times where you can don -1 make your opponent trash a card, so that also works really well with your Magellan leader effect, which make it to where when you don -1 it gains an extra 1k attack or 1k power. We're running 3 of the Douglas Bullet, which help rest blockers for the most part. We're running 4 of the Magellan, as I said earlier, is the heart and soul of the deck and can put your opponent's back a turn. 4 of the Queen to help you cycle through your deck and is a really good blocker. We're running 2 of the Gil Tesoro, which can help you cycle through your deck. 4 of the King, which just help you remove so many things in some of the matchups. Running 3 Thunder Bagua, which can help you ramp, and it's a 2 cost that gives you 4,000. And then we're running the Hell's Judgment, which is a 2 that gives -3 to 2 different characters. So it's just a really good card to help you defend. Overall, like I said, the deck performed really well. So let's get into some matches. For the first match, we have a match against Doflamingo, which traditionally blue is really bad for purple. And so we go first, and we have the Hannibal, which can search out. Here I'm considering whether I should get the Magellan or I should get a Hell's Judgment. But since I went first, you always want to be able to have the Magellan to play on curve and help put your opponent's back a turn. My opponent went second and didn't have a play, which is really good for me. And so here now I have 3 Dawn. Really the only thing I can do is maybe play the Sadi, but I don't have anything she can play with. So I just decided to attack for 8. Just guaranteed that I get the life and then pass. So I keep her in my hand as a 2k counter. My opponent is at 4 Dawn now, and he plays the 1-drop Doflamingo, which lets him look at the top 3 cards of his deck and then rearrange them in the order that he wants. And he can also don -1 when attacking, trash a card, and place one of my 1-drops at the bottom. After arranging his deck, he uses the leader ability and plays a Kuma blocker. I take, as I don't want to get 2 cards out of hand, and then it's my turn. With 5 Dawn here, I'm deciding what to do. Just play the Magellan, don -1, and my opponent also don -1s. And then I swing for 6 at the Kuma to possibly get a 2k counter out of hand. Since it's early, my opponent might have the Pacifista, might not. But the later in the game that I leave it up, then I kind of guarantee that he'll have it. In this case, he did happen to have it, which sucks. But it is what it is. I get rid of a blocker. And I pass turn. My opponent is now at 5 Dawn instead of 6 because of the Magellan. Puts 1 under his Doflamingo leader and then swings with 6 with the Pacifista. I know I'm probably going to take 1 life here, whether it's his or the leader's. So I just take the first one, counter out of the second one with the Sadi, and then I was thinking that my opponent would probably play a 4-drop, but he does play the 3-drop Dofi blocker and a 1-drop Dofi blocker. So he has a lot of blockers to protect the Pacifista, which is why there's a lot of times where purple can struggle with blue. That's because blue can swarm the field a little bit better and still attack. I swing for 6 at the Pacifista, and the reason I do this is because I know I'm going to play my king, and I want to try to get a card out of hand first. And so then I decide to play the king down -1, get rid of the Pacifista, and then swing for 6 with my leader, and my opponent decides to take. I knew that my opponent would defend the Pacifista, whether that was him giving me a card or giving me a blocker. And so I attacked it instead of attacking leader, so that I could get rid of one of his resources, and then either way I was going to KO it with the king. So now I feel a lot better in this matchup as I got rid of his only, big attacker. And I have 2 big attackers on my side that I can use. I attack with the Magellan, and I leave it down. I'm okay if he tries to kill it. Well, it depends. There's times where I'm okay with it dying because then it down -2s my opponent, or I can defend it as it leaves me with the big attacker. It just kind of depends on what my opponent does with his turn. He is at 7 Dawn, so he could play the 7-drop Dofi and put either the king or the Magellan back into my hand. But he plays the Jinbei for 4, and then uses leader effect to get a Gecko Moria, and I just 2k counter. Well, he attacks my Magellan, and there I 2k counter because I want the extra attacker now that my opponent's board is pretty full. And that's more important at this time than just Dawn -2ing my opponent. Same thing, I swing for 6. I have another king, so I'm probably just going to play that to KO it, but I want to try to get resources out of my opponent. So I keep attacking his board. With blue, that's what you want to do. You want to attack their board, because the less characters they have on board, the less attacks they have. And they don't have rush, so there's nothing that's not on board that you have to worry about too much. And then same thing, so I swing at the Gecko Moria to run my opponent out of resources, and either way I play the king to KO it, and then now I swing for 6 at life. He uses a 2k to counter out of it, and then I pass turn. My opponent's at 9 Dawn now, so if he has the Mihawk, he could play the Mihawk, and bottom deck either of my kings or the Magellan. Any of them would be a good target for him. And then he still has the 3-drop Dofi. He plays a Gecko Moria though, so he probably doesn't have the Mihawk. He gets a 2k counter back out, and then swings for 6 at my Magellan, which I have 3 kings, or 3 queens, so I just use 1 to counter out of it. Then he swings for 8 at my Magellan again, and plays the Gecko Moria from the top of his deck. And this is where I am thinking about whether I should just let it go or save it. He can't attack with anything else, so I decide to save the Magellan as it gives me an extra attacker. And I know that that's all my opponent can do, so he's going to pass turn. He passes turn, I draw a Douglas Bullet, which I play here, and I can use that to rest his Dofi blocker and help get rid of it. At the same time, bumping up my leader by 1,000. I could also play the queen to draw cards, but first I decide to put 1 under my Magellan, swing for 7 at the Jinbei. He bottom decks my Hannibal, which doesn't matter to me as I wasn't doing anything with it. I swing for 7 at the Gecko Moria. I know he has a 2k counter. I swing 7 again. He lets it go this time. I play my queen to get some cards out of hand, or to get some cards into my hand, sorry. And then I know I'm going to leave 2 up for my Thunder Bagua, as I, at the time, didn't have any more 2Ks. So I wanted to keep something up to help me save my board. I get rid of the queen as I already have one in hand, and then the other cards, I know the 2 I drew were 2k counters, and the Douglas bullet was just going to be utility as it can rest most of blue. And then I pass turn. He does play the Mihawk now, and he decides to bottom deck a king. Just like I said, any one of my characters at that point were viable targets. He swings for 6, and I kind of want to keep the Douglas bullet, but I also don't want a 2k counter, and so that's what I'm deciding here. I decided to just get rid of 2k counters. I'm probably going to need the Douglas bullet to rest his Dofi, and can be a little bit of a surprise factor for my opponent. He passes turn. I draw a Sadie, and that's what I do. I rest the blocker and put 1 Dawn under the Magellan and swing for 7 at life. I'm thinking about the order that I want to do things here. I can put 1 under my Magellan leader and swing for 7. I decided to just swing for 6 at the Dofi, get rid of it, put 1 Dawn under my king, and then swing for 8. Because I want to leave 2 up for the Thunder Bagua, and at the same time I put my opponent down to 0 life. I still have the queen as a blocker, I still have the Thunder Bagua in hand, and I have 2 2k counters. I think where my opponent struggled a little bit in this match was just not getting the Mihawk early, or even I don't know if he plays the 7-drop Dofi, but either one of those would have really set me back early. And since he didn't see them, and I was able to just keep spamming the board every turn with pretty big bodies, that's kind of what kept me ahead. He swings for 10 at the Mihawk, which is just perfect for the Thunder Bagua, so I'm able to save it. And then now my opponent's thinking. He puts 2 under leader, uses leader effect, and gets the blocker Dofi from the top of his deck and starts arranging the top 5. And he swings it at the Magellan. Which I just use one of my 2k counters to save the Magellan, as it leaves me another viable attacker for next turn. At the moment, my opponent doesn't have any blockers, so the more characters I'm able to keep on board, the more attacks I have. And as all of them are minimum 6k, then it's going to take a lot of cards out of his hand to be able to stop me from attacking. Now my opponent puts 3 under the Gecko Moria, swings 8 at the Magellan, and there you got it. So nothing I can do about that. I only have 1 card in hand, and then my opponent loses to Dawn, which at this stage of the game doesn't matter too much, as he's already at 10, and next turn he's just going to go up to 10. But the Magellan did its job. It put up a lot of pressure throughout the match. I draw another Magellan here. My opponent leaves 3 up, so he could have a Love Beam. So I swing for 9 at life. That way, if he has the Love Beam, he has to give me another card on top of that to stop my attack from going through. He gives me 2 2k counters and a 1k. And then same thing, so I keep attacking for 9s, so that in case he has the Love, then he has to give me 2 cards. But he doesn't, and we take game 1. So it was a really good game. For the second match, we're up against Luffy. And same thing, I choose to go first. I don't have the Magellan, but I do have 2 Hanyabuls, so I decide to keep this hand. Play the Hanyabul, and boom, I get the Magellan. Which if I would have already had a Magellan in hand, I would have got the Hell's Judgment. But because I didn't, I choose. You always want to get the Magellan. Playing it on curve is just really, really strong, and is what makes this deck as good as it can be. I put 2 Dawn under my leader, swing for 7, and then I'm gonna play the second Hanyabul. My opponent thankfully didn't play anything on his turn, Meaning he probably has a lot of high cost characters in his hand. And then here I have the possibility of getting a Magellan or getting a blocker. I decide to get a second Magellan, as if I'm able to play both of them, then it can put my opponent back an entire turn. And then I just pass. My opponent is at 4 Dawn now. Luffy is always hard to predict, because they could play the Whitebeard engine where they play, you know, the Atmos, the King Dews, which it seems like that's what my opponent is doing. He plays the Whitebeard Event Searcher and draws a King Dew. But Luffy's could also play, you know, the Straw Hats with the Masked Deuce, and so Luffy can go a variety of different strategies. He uses the Luffy leader ability to put one under leader, and actually just decides to put everything under leader. I guess he doesn't have. So that's the only downfall with playing the Whitebeard side, is you don't have a lot of small characters that you can play sometimes. I just play the Magellan, so we both Dawn -1, and then that bumps up my leader by 1k. I swing for 6, and my opponent decides to take. And then now this is where my opponent will most likely start playing some of the bigger characters. He does get the Whitebeard Searcher out of life. So the trigger is it just automatically plays it. He draws an Atmos. He's at 5 Dawn now, so he could play the King Dew. He could play that Atmos. He decides to play the King Dew, use leader ability, and swing for 6. Which I could take, but I do have 2/2Ks. And so I decided to use a 2k counter, save my life. And I'm just kind of waiting on my opponent, and then he passes. I'm up to 6 Dawn. So I could play the other Magellan. I do have the Queen as a blocker. I decide to swing with my Magellan first. See if my opponent wants to give me any cards out of hand. Because I'm at 6 Dawn, so I can play the Magellan in the Hannibal. I can play the Queen in the Hannibal. I could play either the Queen or the Magellan and then swing for 7 with my leader. Getting to the point where I would love to be able to have a Hell's Judgment in hand to help save some of my characters. My opponent does decide to counter out of it. He gives me 2 1Ks. So that signifies that at the moment he doesn't have any 2Ks. And so it's pretty good for me. I decide to swing just for 7 with my leader. Start putting a little bit of extra pressure. My opponent plays the Atmos and uses leader ability to put 1 under his leader, and then swings for 7 at my life, which I could counter out of. This one's probably pretty safe to take. I don't want to get rid of, in this situation, so my opponent's fishing for me to get cards out of hand, because then he can attack my board. And if he gets rid of one of my Magellans, and it really sets me back, as he has 2 big attackers and I'll only have 1. So I decided to take that life, but he decides to swing with the King Dew at my life as well, and so this one I'll counter out of. I knew it was probably going to take a life either way if he decided to attack my life, so I counter out of the first one just to kind of see where my opponent wants to go with it. I draw another King, which now I can use my King to get rid of his Atmos and really swing the momentum in my favor. I decide to swing for 6 first at his leader, see if he'll give me any cards. Gives me a 2k. Swing for 6 again. And he gives me 2 1k counters. Then I play the King to get rid of the Atmos. And then I probably most likely just swing for 7. I'm considering to play the Hannibal here, but I decide not to and just swing for 7 at life. And my opponent does use a Radical Beam. So that was a really good turn for me. I was able to get a lot of cards out of my opponent's hand and at the same time whittle away his board a little bit. He plays the Otama on my king and jet pistols it. Then uses leader ability, puts one under leader, puts two more into leader, and swings at life. I just take, I'm okay with that. I don't have a lot of counter in hand anyway, so there's not too much I can do about it. Swings for 8, and I take this as well. And I draw a Hell's Judgment out of life. So here I'm probably going to swing at leader, and then play the queen and the Hell's Judgment, and that'll give me plenty of defense for this coming turn. I could also try to go for game. It's a little risky though, as if my opponent gets a lot of counter out of life, then he just has to block one, and I leave myself exposed. So I attack first with the Magellan just to kind of see what my opponent wants to do. He takes the life. I swing for 6 again. If he would have took that one, then I probably would have just put everything under leader and just gone for game. But since he didn't, then I'll just go the safer route. I swing for 5, which it's the reason I did that instead of playing the queen first to bump up my Magellan was in case my opponent happened to get a jet pistol out of life. I didn't want to lose the queen. And I knew that I was going to play the queen, play a Hannibal to try to get maybe another 2k counter out of life or out of deck, which I do happen to hit as I hadn't seen too many. And I keep 2 up for the Hell's Judgment. Then I pass turn, and my opponent kind of has to go for game here, because next turn I definitely am presenting lethal on board. He doesn't have enough attackers to start clearing my board at this time, because now even the Hannibals are viable attackers. If I just put 3 Dawn under them, he decides to put 9, or he puts 2 Dawn under the King Do, swings for 9, which I decide to use my Hell's Judgment here to put it down to 6 and put the leader down to 2, and then I just use a 2k. And so now if he wants to attack with the leader, he has to put a lot more Dawn under it to make it a viable attacker. He plays the Rush Luffy, puts 1 Dawn under it, but at this point I feel pretty okay. Swings for 9, so I kind of have to take that. Obviously can't block with the queen due to the Rush Luffy's ability, and doesn't swing with the leader. Even if he was swung for 5, it would just been a free block with the queen, and he probably wants to keep 1 up for another radical beam, maybe a guard point. I put 1 under all my characters in case he happens to get a jet pistol out of life, and then swing for 7, so he has to give me either the 2 cards or the radical beam. He takes the first one, and then just keep attacking for 7, duel him down, and leave enough Dawn up to make the Hannibals viable attackers, my leader, and there's just nothing my opponent can do at this point. Yep. He counters out of the first one, and then I swing for 7 again. And that's a GG. Now for the third and final game, we have a matchup against Smoker, which can be a tough matchup. It just kind of depends on the amount of removal my opponent gets. And with me having the Hannibal turn 1, it automatically guarantees my opponent's going to constantly attack for 7. But I kind of need to play the Hannibal to kind of draw some more cards. And I don't hit the Magellan this game, but I do get a Sadie, which gives me a play for next turn, as I can play the Sadie and the blocker, or gives me a 2k counter. My opponent plays the 2-drop blocker. I just swing with the leader. My opponent takes, and then I play the Sadie and the Mina Koala. I decided to play a little bit more aggressive in this matchup, as black normally doesn't have a lot of counter. And that's where black struggles the most, is when you just constantly swing at it at face, which is what makes it not as good as it could be, especially because Zoro is such a prominent deck in the meta. My opponent uses his leader ability, gives my Hannibal -1, and then swings for 7, which I just take. Don't want to go down in hand size too early in the game. Leaves him with 3 Dawn still. He plays a Kobe to get rid of my Sadie. He could have used leader ability on the blocker and then got rid of the blocker, but then he wouldn't have been able to swing for 7. Now here, I'm just trying to maintain my board advantage, and so I play my Douglas Bullet and swing with the blocker for 5 at the Kobe, which he just lets go, and then I swing for 6 at leader. I'm okay attacking with the Mino Koala early because if he KOs it, then I ramp anyway. And then it just gives me a little bit more advantage to play some of my other cards. Then I pass turn. My opponent's at 6 Dawn now, so he could play his Sakazuki, which he does. Gets rid of a card and KOs my Douglas Bullet. So we're just kind of trading punches back and forth for board control. He swings for 5. I don't want to get rid of one of my queens or my 2K counter. I get a Shiki out of life. Doesn't really do anything on board right now. He's too weak to be a viable attacker, and so I just take it, rather keep the 2K counter, and then now I play my queen and get rid of his blocker, and then I just swing with everything that I can anyway. So I swing with the Mino Koala, get some more cards out of hand. My opponent does decide to counter out of it, and then I swing for 6 with my Magellan leader, and my opponent takes that. Now it's my opponent's turn. He goes up to 8 Dawn. So he could play another Sakazuki and then maybe a 2K blocker. He could play a Borsalino, the Kuzan. And that is, he does play another Sakazuki. So he uses the leader ability to give my king -1 and then plays another Sakazuki to KO my king here. And this is what I meant where black can be a little scary if they get all of their removal. With purple, you just kind of play one card at a time as well, and you can't attack with it in the same turn. But thankfully, I've gotten my own form of removal in a way where I had my Douglas Bullet to rest its character to where I could then attack it. And then my king to get rid of one of his as well. He swings for 7 at my Mino Koala to kind of get rid of my board. But I kind of need some board presence. If not, the game's going to get way out of hand for me. So I decide to save it. And then I know that he's going to swing. It's a big decision because I have to block it. I have to save it twice. And so I'm thinking about what will happen if I let it go. I'll go up to 7 Dawn, which would give me enough for a Thunder Boggle and a Queen. Which I do have enough to save it if I decide to save it. And that's what I decide to do. I get rid of both my Sadies. Because I knew I'm going to play my King and my Thunder Boggle. Or not my King, I'm sorry. My Queen and my Thunder Boggle next turn. I know my opponent's going to go to 10 life. And so, or 10 Dawn next turn, which if he plays the Kuzan and KOs one of my characters would be really bad for me, especially if it's Queen. So I decided to play the Magellan instead to boost up my leader. And that way if he decides to destroy the Magellan, then he has to Dawn -2. And it wouldn't be as hurtful for me if he gets rid of the Magellan instead of the Queen. The Queen would really hurt. So I swing for 5 at life, and then I swing for 6 at life to get some more cards out of my opponent's hand, as we're both starting to dwindle on resources. And then I pass. I leave 2 up for the Thunder Bagua. My opponent puts 1 under leader. Well, and the other reason I decided to play the Magellan instead of the Queen was it puts my opponent down to 7 Dawn instead of 8 that he was at currently. And so it puts him back a turn from being able to play the 10 drop. Because if he would have played the 10 drop there, then the game really gets out of hand for me. And there's almost no way that I can win. But with setting him back a turn from playing the 10 drop, then it kind of gives me, you know, an extra foot in the game to just kind of start little by little clawing my way back in. He uses the leader ability on my Hannibal. He plays a Suru to -2 my Magellan, and then uses a Kobe to get rid of it. So then now he has to do, he has to get rid of 2 more Dawn, and then swings for 7 at my blocker. There's no point in getting rid of or using my Thunder Bagua to save it, as he's just going to attack with both Sakazukis at that point. I take it. I get a king out of life. Swings for 7 again. I do decide to use a Thunder Bagua there, as I don't want to go too low on life. And I get an X Drake. So here my opponent has no characters on board. Or I'm sorry, no cards in hand. And so that I know that I can get rid of half of his board at least. So I can play the king, get rid of the Kobe, and then I can attack with my Magellan to at least get rid of one of the Sakazukis. So I think that's where my opponent messed up a little bit, was getting rid of his entire hand, because it leaves him with no defense. I just put 1 under leader after using leader effect and swing at the Sakazuki, and I leave 3 up. Oh, nope. Never mind. I put 3 under my Hannibal and then swing for 5, as is a guaranteed life at this point. I could have left some Dawn up in case he attacks my life and I get a Hell's Judgment, but just guaranteeing a life when we're both starting to get really low on resources is really good. He does get the Great Eruption out of life, which makes me trash a card out of life, which at this point, like I said, when we're both really low on resources, really hurts, because I either have to get rid of a 2K or my Queen blocker. With both are terrible options, but I decide to go with getting rid of the 2K and then keep the Queen so that I can play the Queen blocker. What I didn't keep in mind is my opponent has 3 characters on board and can technically go for game here. And so after I decide that's when that idea comes to mind, and I get a little frustrated with myself, because if I lose based off of 1 counter, that would be terrible. But just kind of see what my opponent decides to go for. That's the one struggle with this deck, is you do have a lot of defense because you run the Thunder Baguas and the Hell's Judgment, but you don't have a lot of counter. And that's what my opponent decides to do here. He swings for 5 with the Suru. Which, if he had done 6 with the Suru, and then maybe 7, and then 9, if I don't draw enough counters out of life to block any of it, I would have lost. But my opponent doesn't know that, and he decides to go for my board with the Suru instead. He could have just gone 4 instead of 5 if he was going to go out the Hannibal, because I only have 1 card in hand, so I can't get out of 4 to 2. And he swings for 7 at life, and for 8 at life. I take both of those and plays a 2-drop blocker. I get lucky and I get 2 blockers out of life, and so I don't have a lot of counters, so I kind of have to play both my blockers because I can't win this turn. My opponent has no cards in hand, so any attack's going to go through, but I only have 2 viable attackers. And so all I can do is get rid of the blocker and maybe a life. I play the Queen to draw 2 cards, and now I do draw a 2K counter and I draw a Hell's Judgment. So I can either keep up enough for the Hell's Judgment, or I need to keep up 4 for a blocker. I'm not able to do both. I can't play a blocker and keep up enough Dawn for the Judgment. So I decide to get rid of the Judgment, as if my opponent happens to draw the 10 drop and gets rid of the Queen, then that's just game. I swing for 7 at the Sakazuki, so he has to block this. But either way, he's going to lose the Sakazuki here because I'll just put 1 Dawn under my leader, swing for 7 at it again, and then play a blocker, and that leaves me with 2 blockers, which, like I said, he has 2 viable attackers in the Tsuru and the leader. And so he does decide to let the Sakazuki go, as he knows that either way it's going to die and he's going to lose the blocker. And so then I just go for I'm perfectly okay with him letting it go, and I just go for life. He takes it so that he can have now 3 characters on board. And I play a blocker, and my opponent disconnects because he knows there's nothing he can do. And that's a good game. It was a lot of like teeter-totter back and forth in the middle of the game. But I think my opponent going down to 0 cards in hand were really what swung the game back in my favor. And so with that, let's go to the final thoughts. Like I said at the beginning, the deck is very surprising. If you can see the Magellan during the middle of the game, it becomes a top tier deck. But in the games where you don't, you struggle a little bit. I don't run a lot of the smaller cards, so the beginning of the match can be a little hairy sometimes, especially if they get a lot of momentum. But with you having so many characters that are high power, it really puts a lot of pressure on your opponent. You know, your bullets are 6k attackers, your Magellans are 6k attackers, your queen blockers themselves can be 6k attackers, your Tesoros can be 6k attacker or are 6k attackers, your king. So your king and your Magellan are the 2 MVPs for this deck. Hell's Judgment as well. It's just such a great card. But your Magellan and your kings are your 2 MVPs in that they just help bring tempo back into your favor. Your Magellan just slows your opponent down to where they can't do some of their bigger plays. Like as we saw in the Smoker matchup, my opponent wasn't able to play the 10 drop. He didn't have it, but if he had, he wouldn't have been able to that turn, which would have been what would have lost me the game. And then the king just brings so much momentum back in your favor when you can just kill, you know, an Atmos, you can kill a 4-drop or lower blocker, just so much versatility in the card. And yeah, the deck was super fun. If it was more viable, I want to say that it would probably be the most represented deck. Like there's so many people that want to play it, want to see it work. And there are just times where like it's just really, really good, and there are times where it struggles just a little bit. But I mean, it was a lot of fun. We had some really surprising wins, and we beat a Smoker and Blue, which we normally shouldn't beat. And we were able to beat a Red and Luffy. So, like I said, the deck is a lot of fun. I really recommend playing it and trying it out. I do feel like it's missing a little something to make it a top tier deck, but piloted well, you can win almost any matchup with this deck. And so with that, thank you all so much again for the support. I really appreciate it. If you enjoyed the content, if you made it this far, please leave a like on the video. Consider subscribing to the channel, commenting below. I try to comment to any comments that are left. And yeah, just thank you all so much for the support. It's really appreciated. And I hope that you all have an amazing day.